Erasmus called Thomas More, a man for all seasons. But when you look at his life, and especially, the public career that he had, it really makes you think about whether that versatility actually, went to his philosophical core. I think it's an important question. Like, how would we explain this to another philosopher?
Yeah, it's a huge question, right? I mean, you have the statesman, the lawyer, the Lord Chancellor. How do you reconcile that with the intellectual who wrote Utopia and, who is dealing with all of these like really profound philosophical questions? I think for, a philosophical audience, what we really have to look at is like, how deep does this go? And is he actually consistent?
Right. So for this deep dive, we're looking at Thomas More. And he lived from 1478 to 1535.
Okay.
And, he was a huge figure in early modern English humanism.
Right.
And, of course, we know him from Utopia and his history of King Richard III.
Right.
But he also had an incredibly diverse public life. I mean, he was a lawyer, a judge, a member of parliament, an ambassador, and a huge advocate for women's education. He was the Speaker of the House of Commons. He was the Lord Chancellor. And, of course, that trajectory leads to his opposition to Henry VIII and ultimately his execution. So how did his philosophical commitments actually inform?
Yeah.
Or maybe even clash with these roles?
Right. Yeah, that's the question, right? And I think it's really important to think about More as someone who stood at the intersection of so many different intellectual currents. He had classical thought, he had the burgeoning humanist movement, and then you had his own incredibly strong religious convictions.
Right.
And so I think what we have to do is, our mission in this deep dive is to really kind of unpack and dissect his philosophical understanding and practice. And I think something that's really interesting and important, especially for, a philosophical audience, is to think about how he saw the light of biblical revelation as actually illuminating, classical reason. So that's what we want to kind of unpack.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he wasn't developing these ideas in a vacuum.
No, of course not.
He was deeply in conversation with the giants of Western thought.
Yeah.
I mean, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Seneca, obviously, the Bible. And then, all those great thinkers of the early church. Augustine, Jerome, Basil, and Chrysostom.
Yeah, absolutely.
These figures provided the very language and the concepts that he used to understand the world. So
yeah, and that's something we really see in his early life. Actually, Erasmus gives us this kind of interesting glimpse into More's early intellectual development, and he talks about how, the young More was really deeply engaged with Greek literature and philosophy, and there's even a mention of More writing a dialogue in support of Plato's ideas of communalism, which actually extended to, the sharing of wives, which is
wow.
Which is for a philosopher, that's pretty amazing. We don't have that dialogue.
Yeah, what arguments was he actually developing at that point?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it shows that from a very young age, he was grappling with those philosophical questions about society and ownership and the right, from the very beginning.
Totally. But then what's really interesting is fast forward a little bit later in More's life, and Erasmus describes his household as a second Platonic academy, but he actually says that the focus has shifted. So it's now on piety and the study of scripture and the wisdom of the church fathers.
Right.
So we kind of see this evolution, right, in his philosophical priorities and thinking about how his faith is starting to become even more, integrated with his philosophical ideas.
Right. That transition is so crucial to understand. And it wasn't just personal. He really believed in the power of education.
Yeah.
And he extended this incredibly rigorous curriculum to his daughters, which, it really rivaled what his son was receiving. They were studying Greek, Latin, the liberal arts, so grammar, rhetoric, logic, poetry, mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, alongside theology and even medicine.
Wow.
So what does that tell us about, his philosophical anthropology?
Well, I think it really shows that he believed in the intellectual capacity of, every person.
Right.
And the importance of, cultivating reason and virtue through, this broad, comprehensive type of learning.
Right.
What's also really interesting is that Erasmus and Richard Pace both likened him to Democritus, the laughing philosopher.
Right.
And Pace even said that More was able to find value in various philosophical schools, but his real talent was in revealing the ridiculous.
Right.
So when we're thinking about, philosophically analyzing this, it suggests, a critical and maybe even like skeptical edge to the way he engaged with different doctrines, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and this knack for spotting the ridiculous that Pace observed, it really resonates, with the Socratic emphasis on self-examination and, exposing unfounded beliefs.
Yeah, totally.
And for both Socrates and the young Moor, it was the people who lacked self-awareness who, really became the targets of philosophical scrutiny.
Right.
And a lot of times it was delivered with humor.
Yeah.
So it wasn't always, totally serious. It showed a practical application of philosophy to everyday life.
Absolutely. And I think his fondness for Lucian, who is like his favorite comic dialogue writer, reinforces this.
Yeah.
He really admired Lucian's Socratic irony and his ability to blend, entertainment with instruction and to, not embrace like the arrogant pronouncements of the philosophers or the wanton wiles of the poets.
Right.
So it suggests, this kind of grounded, engaging philosophy that's wary of, too much extraction or, dogmatism.
Right. And he wasn't just reading these things passively. He was actively engaging with them. And he really immersed himself in, rigorous Greek studies. He was, called faithful to Aristotelian realism. And we see this in his letter to Dorp, where he gives this really sophisticated exploration of dialectic and even the nature of language.
Yeah.
So what does that tell us about his philosophical methodology?
Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting is his understanding of language as being fluid,
right,
and dependent on custom. So he recognized that words aren't like, these fixed entities.
Right.
They get their meaning from shared usage,
right,
which is, that's a very, important point to make.
Right.
And then also the way he views true dialectic is really interesting. He sees it as this intellectual exercise, but it's really aimed at uncovering the truth. And it's not just about winning a debate or scoring points, which for a philosopher is fundamental.
Right. It's that honest pursuit of understanding.
Yeah.
Not just like, oh, I got you.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like the point is not scoring points.
Right.
The point is understanding.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally. And even within his respect for, Aristotle, like he clearly had a lot of respect for Aristotle, but he still maintained like this intellectual autonomy.
Right.
He has that famous line where he says that he esteems Aristotle more than many, but still along with many.
Yeah.
Right. So, he's not just willing to blindly follow the ideas of even the greatest thinkers. He wants to chart his own intellectual path,
right,
which I think is crucial to understanding him as a philosopher.
Yeah.
And then this really comes out in his engagement with Plato. His early biographer, Stapleton, emphasized that more, read especially Plato, and even adopted his like dialogic style of writing,
right,
which is so central, I think, to Utopia. And as people have kind of dug deeper into more, they see this dialogic cast of mind in, a lot of his other works too.
Right.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, he wants to explore these philosophical questions in this way where it's, he's putting different perspectives into conversation with one another.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think among all those ancient philosophers, he held Plato alone in the highest regard. He actually called him the great philosopher and wise, but it was Socrates, I think, who really captivated more. I mean, he called him the best philosopher.
Right.
So what do you think it is about Socrates that was like so appealing to him?
Well, I think More's interpretation of Socrates' concept of philosophy is really helpful here. Socrates saw philosophy as the meditation or exercise of death. And More understands that as like a continual effort. He says that we should try to sever the soul from the love and affections of the body while they be together. So it's this kind of preparatory discipline for attaining true wisdom, right?
Right.
Detaching from earthly distractions.
Right.
And I think for, a philosophical audience, that should resonate.
Yeah, absolutely.
The idea of transcendence.
Right.
And pursuing this kind of higher knowledge. And I think, you see this in his early Fortune verses where he kind of paints this picture of Socrates achieving merry cheer, wisdom, and liberty because he's escaped the bondage of fortune. And he does that through understanding, the deeper order of nature. It's like, this kind of inner freedom.
Right.
Through philosophical insight, which is, that's a very classical, philosophical pursuit.
Yeah.
And so for More, I think Socrates' primary concern was ethics,
Right.
When he paraphrases Socrates' view of philosophy, he's actually directly referencing Plato's Phaedo. And in the Phaedo, Socrates argues that, a true philosopher must liberate the soul from bodily desires. These are the things that, actually impede the pursuit of truth and virtue. And so that image, right, that the body is a prison for the soul, which is, this provocative image from the Phaedo, I think really resonated with More's understanding of, how difficult it is to achieve, intellectual and moral clarity.
Right. But this is where we see a really critical divergence.
Yeah.
Because while More understood, that the senses and the passions could cloud judgment, his Christian faith led him to this more integrated view of the soul and the body.
Yeah, totally.
He believed that they were so knit and joined together as to constitute one person, and they were capable of this kind of harmony, but it was through proper education and discipline and divine grace.
Yeah.
So that's a big difference from a purely dualistic Platonic view.
Yeah. And I think More very much follows Augustine here in his understanding of, how to view the soul. So, the soul is created in God's image, endowed with memory, understanding, and will, which reflects, the Trinity. And so More recognizes, this ever-present danger
Right.
of, these brutish appetites that can corrupt, this image and reduce us to, something base. And so he's constantly talking about this spiritual battle
Right.
that's needed to ensure that that reason rules as a king, right?
Yeah.
Which ultimately leads to true liberty, which for him is understood as, living in accordance with reason.
Right.
And, rightly ordered law.
Yeah. And More wasn't just theorizing about this. He was giving practical guidance.
Yeah.
How do you actually liberate the soul for truth and right reason in all things?
Mm-hmm.
And he, he gives his 12 rules and his 12 weapons of spiritual battle in his additions to the life of John Pico.
Right.
And he emphasizes there that true, genuine and lasting joy. Yeah.
Comes from virtue and a clear conscience.
Yeah.
And it's a much deeper satisfaction than any fleeting physical pleasure could give. So what does this, ethical framework tell us about his philosophical aims, overall?
Well, I think it suggests, a really practical orientation.
Yeah.
He's not just interested in, philosophical speculation. He's really trying to apply these principles to the cultivation of virtue.
Right.
And, to the attainment of this kind of inner peace. What's interesting is he actually distinguishes this from Stoicism.
Right.
So in his 12 properties of a lover, he actually emphasizes love's willingness to endure suffering.
Right.
For the sake of, the beloved, both human and divine.
Right.
So this introduces an element of Christian charity and, self-sacrifice that goes, I think, beyond what the Stoics, really emphasize, which is, self-control and detachment. Right, right, absolutely. And you see that ethical emphasis continue in his later prose works. So in The Four Last Things, in Dialogue of Sir Thomas More, Knight.
Yeah.
And he really explores this idea of cultivating inward spiritual pleasure through genuine contemplation of the soul. As opposed to relying on false imagination or the vain pleasures of the flesh, And he even alludes to Plato's Phaedrus with that image of the reasoning charioteer that has to rein in the unruly passions of the soul.
Yeah, and the metaphor of the garden, right? The garden of our soul is so apt because it suggests that this is, you have to cultivate it. You have to. You have to tend to the garden.
Yeah.
And he encourages us to cultivate these spiritual affections, but they have to be guided by reason. So it's this active and continuous process. It's not something that, you just do once and you're done.
Right.
It's this, moral and intellectual development that you're constantly engaged in.
Yeah. And even in his early life, we see, those philosophical tendencies emerging.
Yeah.
So there's a story that Lord Chancellor Morton was completely astonished by young More's improvisational theatrical skills.
Really?
Yeah. And some scholars have actually interpreted this as an early manifestation of self-awareness in relation to others.
Interesting.
This kind of nascent conscience in the sense of knowing with, right?
Wow, yeah. That's a great connection.
Yeah. And his early pageant verses, I think, offer, even more evidence for this. They're these dramatic monologues, and each one represents a different stage of life.
Okay.
And they're imbued with this this degree of humor, but they show that early engagement with the human condition, the temptations of pleasure, and the stark reality of death. And even the concluding Latin verses actually invite the reader to engage in self-reflection and to make their own choices in the context of like a loving God. So it's this almost like a philosophical sketch of the human lifespan.
Wow.
From a very young age. And then you have, Rueful Lamentation, which was Queen Elizabeth's deathbed monologue.
Right.
And he wrote that when he was only 25, which is just...
Wow.
It's just incredible. And it really powerfully conveys that transient nature of worldly possessions.
Yeah.
And this, the ultimate equalizer that is death, lo, here I lie. And we see those same reflections on the fickleness of flattering fortune in those later poems that he writes while he's in prison.
Yeah.
So what do these early reflections on mortality tell us about his developing philosophy?
Well, I think it suggests this early and sustained awareness, the limitations of earthly life.
Right.
And the importance of really focusing on things that, that are more enduring. And his fortune verses are especially revealing of his early philosophical mind.
Yeah.
So it's this, three-part kind of exploration of how to live in a world that's, seemingly governed by chance.
Right.
And it goes from, kind of a straightforward rejection of fortune to this more, nuanced dialogue between Lady Fortune and this wise interlocutor. So, philosophically, this kind of dialectical approach to a perennial problem is really important, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the wisdom that ultimately emerges is this, deliberate choice of glad poverty by figures like Socrates, which leads to, felicity and free liberty.
Right.
This freedom that comes from satisfying only, essential needs.
Yeah.
And that early emphasis on free liberty and how it's so intrinsically linked to wisdom and virtue becomes such a foundational theme that runs throughout all of his work. It really does. So that early focus on truth and wonder, really marks him as a philosophical mind in the making.
Absolutely. And then his engagement with Augustine and Lucian, I think, gives us, some more really valuable insights into his philosophical sensibilities.
Right.
So his 1501 lectures on Augustine's City of God are pretty amazing because he focuses on the historical and philosophical dimensions of the City of God and not so much on, the theological intricacies.
Right.
So it just shows how, intellectually broad he was even at that early stage. And at the same time, he's mastering Greek and he's collaborating with Erasmus on the Lucian dialogues and declamations.
Right.
So this just shows this really deep interest in philosophical inquiry, but inquiry that can, incorporate humor and satire and...
Yeah. It's interesting that his first published work was that collaboration on Lucian. It was a critique of the humorously critiqued the arrogant pronouncements of philosophers. And then, you juxtapose that with his deep engagement with Augustine's profound reflections on history and the human condition.
Yeah.
And you see a mind that appreciates both the critical wit and the deep contemplation.
Right.
And then there's that original declamation on tyrannicide.
Yeah.
Which reveals his deep-seated hatred of tyranny and his commitment to, civic liberty and virtue.
Yeah.
Which is, a pretty strong political stance, especially for that time.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it is really striking to think about his choice to translate Lucian alongside his study of Augustine, and the City of God itself. Augustine talks about all the disagreements between the different philosophical schools, and so this leads Augustine to have a certain amount of skepticism, right, about philosophy itself.
Yeah.
But then more, as much as he respected Augustine, he still maintained his own critical distance. He famously said, being a man, Augustine could make a mistake. So he's not going to just blindly adhere to, even revered authorities.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a defining characteristic of more as an intellectual. He wants to think for himself, which is, for a philosopher, it's paramount.
Yeah. It really underscores his commitment to independent judgment, which he actively cultivated, in the education of his own children. Mm-hmm. He really wanted to cultivate good judgment and that capacity for critical thinking.
Yeah, and he saw Lucian's appeal as being, in his ability to probe these deep questions, but without disturbing, one's equanimity.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of philosophical composure, even when you're dealing with ideas that might be, challenging.
Yeah, challenging or even disturbing.
Yeah. And so I think that's something that really appealed to More. And, while he shares with Socrates this, focus on the well-ordered soul, he does depart from Socrates in his conviction that, ultimate truth and virtue are accessible through divine revelation.
Yeah.
So this integration of faith and reason, I think that's, really the cornerstone of his philosophical framework.
Yeah, it's so foundational to everything that he does.
Yeah.
And this leads us to what we might call More's movement towards a civil philosophy.
Okay.
And I think, his publication in 1510 of Life of Pico, which is this carefully edited version of Giovanni Pico della Mirandolla's biography, is a really good example of this.
Okay.
And he actually removed elements that didn't really align with his Orthodox Christian worldview.
Right.
Most notably, he really gave prominence to Thomas Aquinas in the text. So what do you think motivated those editorial choices?
Well, I think, what's interesting about it is that More actually adds these ironic additions to Pico's biography, where he emphasizes the profit of philosophy, especially its contribution to moral virtue.
Yeah.
And this is contrasted with Pico's more aristocratic view of philosophy.
Right.
So for More, he's really interested in the active life of civic engagement,
Right.
as opposed to this reclusive life of the solitary scholar.
Yeah.
And he actually draws on Cicero and Seneca and their understanding of philosophy as a practical and beneficial art. And he criticizes both Pico and later the character Hythloday in Utopia for, potentially neglecting their civic responsibilities.
Right.
And so I think this really underscores More's, this deep commitment to a philosophy that is active, that engages with the world, that contributes to the common good. It's not enough to just, sit in your study and
Right.
And think great thoughts. You actually have to get out there and do something.
Right.
And I think he really believed that philosophers have a responsibility to their communities.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really interesting, to look at his history of King Richard III, because we see, the potential pitfalls of neglecting this civil dimension.
Yeah.
And it's this stark depiction of how, human beings, even those who are, rational creatures, can choose to disregard reason,
Right.
because they're driven by, desire and self-interest.
Right. Absolutely.
And we see this in Edward V's tragic yielding to his desires.
Right.
We see this in Queen Elizabeth abandoning her own better judgment.
Right.
And so I think what's really interesting about this philosophically is that it just shows how fragile reason can be.
Yeah.
Especially when it's confronted with these really powerful emotions.
Right.
And so this is why it's so important to cultivate virtue.
Right.
Because you want to make sure that reason is, maintaining that proper guiding role in your soul. And this, I think, really aligns well with his satirical epigrams, which often focus on the importance of self-knowledge and, a well-ordered soul as being really important prerequisites for having good judgment.
Right.
And I think what's cool about those poems is that they really cover a wide range of human experience.
Yeah.
They go from, the everyday lives of ordinary people to really pointed critiques of rulers and those in power. So I think the breadth and the wit of his Latin poems and epigrams are really an overlooked aspect of his philosophical contribution and his understanding of human beings.
Right.
So,
and many of those political epigrams address that, ever-present threat of tyranny.
Yeah.
And he was actually accused, because of some of the things that he wrote. So it's clear that his philosophical reflections were having real political consequences.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, his epigrams were later published alongside Utopia. And so you have this kind of intellectual dialogue between the more direct commentary, oftentimes satirical commentary of the poems, and then the more complex allegorical, exploration of the ideal state in Utopia.
Right.
And they even share terms and themes.
Yeah.
Like the concept of, the true princeps.
Yeah. And I think it's notable, too, that, More really emphasizes, using terms like citizens and people.
Right.
Rather than, subjects, which I think it says something about his commitment to civic dignity and responsibility.
Right.
Which, again, I think is rooted in his philosophical understanding of, what it means to be human and the purpose of government.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And all of this groundwork leads us to More's most famous and most, debated work, Utopia.
Yeah.
And it's this, amazing fusion of Plato's and Cicero's ideas about the ideal commonwealth.
Right.
But it's also got Lucian's sharp satirical wit.
Yeah.
And I think, even the title On the Best State of a Commonwealth and On the New Island of Utopia, it immediately signals, that he is in conversation with classical political philosophy. So how should we, as a philosophical audience, how should we approach interpreting this really complex text?
Well, I think that the central question that More is asking in book one is crucial, and that's the relationship, between philosophy and then the practical realities of governing.
Right.
So you have Raphael Hiflode, who argues that true philosophy, like, the real deal, can only flourish in a society like Utopia that's, untainted by, like, the corrupting influences of, European politics.
Right.
But then, Thomas Morris, the character, actually advocates for, this more civil philosophy. So this is one that, engages with the political structures that are already in place. Host,